Welcome back to the Left Library. Today we're looking at a text that challenges something most people assume is timeless, the family. Alexandra Kollontai's Communism and the Family, written just after the revolution in Russia, asks a deceptively simple question. Is the family a permanent human institution or a social arrangement shaped by economics? Most societies treat the family as natural. Parents raise children privately, households organise daily survival, and emotional life is expected to revolve around a domestic unit. Kollontai argues this structure is not eternal. It belongs to a specific stage of economic development, capitalism, and as the organisation of society changes, the form of family life must change too. She writes bluntly, "The old family is dying." She does not mean that affection disappears. She means that the economic function that created the modern household is disappearing, just as feudal society had one type of family and capitalism produced another. Socialism produces a different one again. The aim of the text is therefore not to abolish love, but to understand why the private family existed and why communism transforms it. Kollontai begins by rejecting the belief that the modern nuclear family has always existed. Instead, she explains that the family structures follow material conditions. In earlier societies, the household was a unit of production. Families farmed together, produced clothing together, and collectively ensured survival. The family existed because economic life required cooperation inside a small domestic group. Capitalism reorganised this entirely. Work moved into factories and offices, production became social, thousands cooperating, but daily life remained private. The family no longer produced goods for society. Instead, it maintained workers for the labour market. The household became a maintenance unit for labour power. People still had to eat, rest, and raise children, but rather than organising this collectively, capitalism left it to private households. This meant survival work, such as cooking, cleaning, and childcare, continued but disappeared from public recognition. The family now existed less to produce goods and more to reproduce workers. Kollontai then focuses on women's position inside this system. Industrialization brought women into wage labour, but domestic responsibilities did not disappear. Instead, they were added on top of employment. She writes, open quote, "The working woman has no time to be a good housewife," end quote. This describes the double burden, paid work plus unpaid domestic labour. Cooking, cleaning, laundry, childcare, all necessary for society, remained private duties. These tasks produce no wage but are essential for the workforce to exist. Without them, workers cannot appear at work fed, clothed, or raised. So the household becomes hidden economic labour. Kollontai's point is not moral blame, but structural explanation. Women's inequality persists because capitalism relies on unpaid domestic work while treating it as a personal obligation rather than social labour. The private family, therefore, becomes part of the economic system itself. If the private household exists because labour must be maintained privately, what happens when our society organises production collectively? Kollontai argues the same principle must be applied to daily survival. Communism socialises domestic labour. Instead of each household cooking separately, public kitchens exist. Instead of isolated childcare, collective childcare develops. Laundry, education, and care become social services rather than private duties. She explains, open quote, "The communist society takes upon itself all the duties which formerly weighed upon the individual family," end quote. The household does not need to be destroyed. It becomes unnecessary. Its functions move outward into society. So communism transforms everyday life not by banning families, but by removing the economic pressures that created them. Once the household is no longer required for survival, relationships change meaning. In capitalism, partnerships often carry economic dependence. Shared rent, shared childcare, shared domestic labour. Emotional life is tied to necessity. Separation risks poverty. Kollontai believes that this distorts love. When survival depends on a partner, affection mixes with obligation and fear. In a society where survival is guaranteed socially, relationships become voluntary. People remain together because they want to, not because they must. Love becomes companionship rather than property. She does not argue attachment weakens. She argues it becomes honest, freed from material compulsion. Next, Kollontai discusses children and the collective responsibility for raising them. This section is the most misunderstood part of the text, and Kollontai spends significant time clarifying it. She does not argue that parents stop caring for children. She argues that children should not depend entirely on private household circumstances for their well-being. Under capitalism, childhood is unequal by design. Some children grow in stable homes with time and resources, others grow in poverty where parents work constantly. Yet, society ultimately depends on all children becoming future members of the community. So the burden placed on individual parents is both unfair and inefficient. Kollontai proposes collective responsibility. Society guarantees food, education, healthcare, and development. Parents retain emotional bonds, but survival is no longer determined by a family's income or available time. This changes parenthood itself. Instead of constant economic anxiety, parents can focus on affection and guidance. Children are not removed from parents, they are protected from economic inequality. She argues that private childcare isolates families and exhausts individuals. Next, Kollontai addresses the fear that without the traditional family, morality collapses. She argues the opposite. Moral systems reflect material conditions. Capitalist morality emphasizes permanence and control because economic dependence requires stability. Marriage today often becomes a survival arrangement, and fidelity becomes linked to property-like expectations. Remove economic dependency and moral expectations shift. People must act responsibly not because of law or because necessity forces them to, but because others' well-being genuinely depends on social cooperation. She believes a collective society requires a higher form of ethics, consideration, empathy, and accountability. Relationships become moral through responsibility rather than obligation. In capitalism, breaking a relationship can produce material harm, homelessness, hunger, insecurity. In a collectivized society, emotional harm remains possible, but economic coercion disappears. Moral responsibility therefore becomes clearer, not weaker. She imagines a culture where care is socialized and emotional honesty valued more than formal permanence. Morality evolves from property relations to human relations. Is historical rather than destructive. The modern family formed because capitalism required private households to maintain workers. Once society collectively organizes production and care, the economic necessity for that structure fades. Open quote, the old family is dying, end quote, because its function disappears. Communism, in her view, does not abolish relationships. It removes survival pressure from them. Care becomes collective, love becomes voluntary, and childhood becomes socially guaranteed. The family is revealed not as an eternal human constant, but as a changing social arrangement shaped by economic life. As society changes, so does intimacy itself.